I'd like now to introduce our speaker, Benton Murphy. You can see his CV there on the screen. He's a master gardener from our class of 22 and has jumped in and been educating people ever since, both on orchids and other topics like cacti. So Ben, welcome.
Thanks, Colleen. I really appreciate it. Yep. Cacti and succulents is another passion of mine in gardening as well as vegetable gardening. So I'm really happy to be here. And thank you so much for joining us today on this conversation about orchids. I'm excited to have this conversation. Orchids have been a passion of mine for a really long time. You can't see it, but right over here on my shoulder, I have a collection of orchids that are inhabiting my window and make me happy every time I have to work from home here, from my desk here in my home office. Orchids are beautiful. They're diverse. They can be mysterious for people. So hopefully over the course of today's conversation, we can help to demystify some aspects of orchids and really want to encourage everybody to try growing an orchid indoors or outdoors. Both are options for us here in this region, depending on the right species. What are we going to talk about today? This is our agenda for our discussion. I do want to stress that this is going to be a 101 level presentation, as the title would imply. If you do have really advanced questions or advanced questions about a specific plant that the answer to which would probably benefit from some pictures, we do have the help desk that Nicole has put into the chat. That's a great way to get some of those specific questions answered. But for general questions, we will have several opportunities to break to talk about your questions around orchids. So please feel free to pop questions in the chat as we move along. But we're going to talk today about 5 big buckets. We're going to start with backgrounding on orchids and their anatomy. Then we're going to talk about a selection of popular orchid genera that people would frequently grow in their homes. We're also going to talk about tips on plant selection and overall care. We're going to talk about pests, diseases, and their treatments. And of course, we're going to be addressing your questions as we move along as well. So what are orchids? Orchids are a plant family. They are actually the second largest plant family, botanically speaking. There's more than 28,000 orchid species across the planet. The only bigger plant family is Asteraceae with 32,000 species. They are monocots, meaning that they grow one embryonic leaf. Similar to a lot of other familiar plants like corn and palm trees, these are all monocots. 11% of all flowering plants around the world are orchids. A lot of plants that you will take a look at their blossom, look at their anatomy, you may not necessarily even recognize it as an orchid. That's how broad and diverse this plant family is. Orchids grow in a lot of different situations. They're terrestrial, meaning they grow on the ground. They're epiphytic, meaning they grow on the sides of trees, and they can even be lithophytic, meaning that they can grow on bare rocks. So orchids are all over the place. Humans have had a long-standing history with orchids. Orchids evolved on Earth more than 120 million years ago, but our relationship dates back to about 3,000 or 4,000 years at the minimum. We do have records of orchids being mentioned in that time frame in Japan and China around medicinal uses. In Western culture, orchids are first mentioned by Theophrastus, who is the father of botany around the year 300 BCE. He's the person who actually gifted orchids with their name. Orchid is actually derived from the Greek word orchis, which is actually the word for testicle, because some terrestrial orchids in Europe, their roots resemble that part of the body, interestingly enough. Many more orchids came into our lives after the conquest of the New World. The Spanish conquerors brought back the vanilla bean, for instance, from Central America around the year 1510. And of course, orchids are really prevalent in culture. If you've ever been to prom, you might have had a Cattleya wrist corsage put on your wrist. If you've ever gotten off of a plane in Hawaii, you might have gotten a dendrobium lei placed around your neck. Orchids are the national flower of many nations across the globe, so they definitely show up in our everyday lives all the time. We may just not recognize it. So where do orchids come from? They're a cosmopolitan group of species, meaning that they're present in almost everywhere around the globe. They're on every continent except for Antarctica. They're in every biome except for glaciers. And here's just a couple of examples of some familiar or not familiar orchids and sort of where they come from. Starting in North America, that's the putty root orchid. They can be found on forest floors right here in our region. Down there in the Caribbean, that's a Tolumnia variegata, a tiny fan-shaped epiphytic species that you can find across the Caribbean. That pink flower that's hovering there over Brazil, that is an example of a Cattleya. That's that corsage orchid that I was mentioning earlier. Over Africa, that's a really cute little bulbophyllum nultans that lives in Madagascar. Some very weird looking species in the bulbophyllum genera that we'll talk about a little bit later. Someone in the chat had mentioned a vanda, that pink flower hovering over South Asia and India. That's a vanda. That's where they sort of come from. And probably the most famous orchid at this point in our lives is that one on the far right. That is an example of a Phalaenopsis schilleriana, which is a native orchid to the Philippines that has gifted much of its genetic material to the hybrids that you will find in grocery stores and big box stores. That is where a lot of the genetics came from for many of the orchids that you will buy. So as you can see, orchids are all around us. A little bit more about their anatomy here. The blossoms are one of the things that people really gravitate to with orchids because they are exotic and beautiful and very diverse in terms of the way that they look. But there's actually some pretty significant commonalities across orchids in terms of their blossom anatomy. They are zygomorphic, which means that they are bilaterally symmetrical. So you can imagine sort of printing this picture of this blossom out on a piece of paper and folding it vertically. Each half of that paper will look substantially similar. So it's symmetrical, kind of like a human face. Orchids generally grow flowers with 3 sepals and 3 petals. They're highly modified, so that labellum that you see in the example, that is actually their third petal that has been modified as a landing plat for pollinators to help in the reproductive process. Blossoms are also interesting if you watch them as they develop as buds on a flower stalk developing into the full flower. They will actually twist 180 degrees. It's called resupination. And this is to allow the flower to position itself so that those pollinators can land on that labellum on the bottom of the flower. Absolutely beautiful Phalaenopsis orchid here. Actually, I think that was a Cymbidium. Apologies. A little bit more about anatomy here. There are 2 main form functions for orchids generally in terms of the style or the way that they grow. Monopodial orchids grow from one single growth point along basically the stem. So their leaves will generate from the top of this stem over time. You can sort of think about it as monopodial orchids growing vertically. Like you can see this vanilla orchid that's growing up this tree, right? A lot of monopodial species are very popular. Your Phalaenopsis, your Vanda, your vanilla orchids are all good examples of monopodial orchids. You can see that the picture on the right here is a Phalaenopsis that's in my collection. Those gangly roots that are coming out the side, those are air roots, a very common feature in a lot of orchid species. Those are roots that have been modified to draw moisture from the air. The other big grouping of orchids are sympodial orchids. These are plants that, as opposed to monopodial that grow vertically, you can think about sympodial orchids as growing horizontally along the ground. Sympodial orchids form these structures called pseudobulbs, and I've included a little orange arrow to indicate where a pseudobulb is on that particular plant. Those are those fleshy, bulb-looking structures that inhabit the space between the leaves and the roots. And these are modified stems that basically act as nutrient and water storage devices. This is where the flower spikes on sympodial orchids are generated from pseudobulbs. Usually each pseudobulb will produce no more than 1 spike. But again, they do creep along the ground horizontally, which is important to remember when you're potting them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are a lot of really popular sympodial orchid genera, including Oncidiums, Cattleyas, Paphiopedilums, and Dendrobiums are all good examples of sympodial orchids. Another big difference in terms of the way that orchids grow is, again, the situation that they're growing within. Very diverse. Terrestrial orchids, like those lady slippers you see at the top of this image, grow right in the ground. You can find them in the forest floor. They grow rhizomatic roots similar to many other forest floor plants. Paphiopedilums, cypripediums, epidendrums, and cymbidiums are all good examples of terrestrial orchids. Many of the orchids that you will grow in your home are actually epiphytic, meaning that they grow on the side of a tree or some other support structure. And they have, again, developed those aerial roots that help them to draw moisture from the air. Phalaenopsis, Vandas, Cattleyas, Oncidiums, and Dendrobiums are a good example of epiphytic orchids. And you can just sort of see, this is an image from the Botanical Gardens here in Washington, D.C., of a massive ball of Phalaenopsis orchids that they had hanging from the ceiling the last time I was over there. Really just drawing that moisture from the air and not requiring any ground whatsoever to grow within. It's important to know as we're diving in our next section here about a specific orchid genera and sort of how to navigate the orchid family is an important discussion to have because it can be a little bit complex. Again, with so many species and more than 800 genera of orchids, you just have to be really specific about which one you're talking about. And so in order to do that, you have to understand orchid terminology and have an understanding of the fact that there is a difference between species orchids, meaning orchids that you would encounter naturally in nature, versus hybrids. I mentioned there's 28,000 specific species of orchids, but there's more than 100,000 registered orchid hybrids. Hybrids are where a breeder has basically taken 2 different orchids and bred them together to gain physical characteristics that they find appealing or commercially desirable. So here's an example of a hybrid orchid that's in my collection right now. This yellow orchid is a Phalaenopsis, is a cross between two hybrids, a Sogo Manager and a Sogo Pikachu, named after the Pokemon. The hybrid name there is Phalaenopsis Sogo Manager X Sogo Pikachu. The X indicates the cross, right? So those are the two hybrids that have been bred together to create this plant. In that name, the genera is Phalaenopsis. The hybrid is Sogo. So in this particular plant, two Sogo hybrids were interbred together. And the specific cultivar of those two plants that were bred together were Manager and Pikachu. I believe Manager gives some of the yellow and the Pikachu gives some of the spotting in this plant. I believe that's correct. But that gives you a sense of how to read that name just to understand what you're looking at the store or online if you're purchasing an orchid. It's also important to note that while this orchid is a cross between two Phalaenopsis orchids, many genera and Orchidaceae can be hybridized across genera. So for instance, a Phalaenopsis can be interbred with a Vanda orchid. And in that instance, there is basically something called a Gnathogenera that is created there to describe the family of plants that are created when you cross a Phalaenopsis and a Vanda. So Vandanopsis is the name of that Gnathogenera for a cross-genera hybrid, right? If you're confused about this, it's not surprising because there are many varieties and hybrids and names for orchids to their full list of abbreviations for a different orchid Gnathogenera. If memory serves, it's 15 pages long and like 10-point font. So there are many Gnathogenera out there, many different types of hybrids, which can be intimidating, but it also means that there's just a huge amount of diversity and beauty amongst these hybrids for you to learn more about. Orchid names, if you see them, especially online, may have some additional characters at the end of the name. A lot of times this may indicate that that particular hybrid has received some awards. So for instance, if you see FCC/AOS after the name of an orchid, that indicates that that orchid has been awarded with the first class certificate from the American Orchid Society. Okay, so there's lots of different prizes, and hybridizers will sometimes put those initials at the end of their hybrid name to indicate that that is in fact what's going on. It's also important when you think about orchids, and as we jump into the next couple slides here to talk about specific genera a little bit more, there is a concept in the space of orchids called alliances, right? And so you could hear about the Phalaenopsis Alliance or the Oncidium Alliance. As I mentioned, there are many, many genera of orchids, and it can be complicated in terms of thinking through the care instructions for these orchids. So botanists and other orchid enthusiasts have grouped orchids together into what are called alliances. So if you hear the Oncidium Alliance, they're talking about Oncidium orchids, as well as other orchids that either look or can be cared for similarly to Oncidiums, just to make it a little bit simpler for people to understand those groupings. Just a note of caution before we go in here and talk about some specific orchid genera and care tips for them, that you really need to know your species. As I mentioned, orchids are very diverse, and while there are general high-level care tips for these genera in terms of what you're supposed to be giving them around light or water humidity, there is always an exception to the rule. This is what trips up a lot of people when it comes to growing orchids in their homes, that they may not know the exact species that they're growing, and there may be very specific growing conditions that that orchid requires in order to survive and thrive in your home. So please do try as much as possible to know the specific species, cultivar, hybrid, what have you, of your orchid so you can understand the specific care requirements of that plant. If you're buying a new orchid, hopefully this is information that the seller would be able to give to you. If you already have an orchid in your collection, you could try plant ID apps, or if you really need an expert to identify it or someone who is in the know, you could try social media, try Reddit, sort of crowdsource some of these suggestions. Take it all with a grain of salt, but they may be able to point you in the right direction. So diving into some specific genera here, starting with Phalaenopsis, let's slide on a couple of popular genera that people are growing at home. And on each one of these slides, I'm going to be giving you some notes on light, water, humidity, temperature, and potting preferences. But we're going to talk about each one of those subjects a little bit more in depth in the next section. Okay. So Phalaenopsis, these are probably the most familiar orchids for many people on this webinar. There are approximately 70 individual species of Phalaenopsis orchids in the wild, not including hybrids. Phalaenopsis are monopodial epiphytes, meaning, again, they grow in a vertical line and they grow primarily on trees. They are known in common parlance as the moth orchid. Many people will recognize that versus Phalaenopsis. Most of the time, if you go into that grocery store, that big box store, these are the orchids that you're going to be finding, at least in our region. They are mostly native to Southeast Asia, although there is one Phalaenopsis species that is native to Australia. Across most of these orchid families, Indonesia is basically the hub for a lot of these tropical plants that we have in our homes. Indonesia into India, Southeast Asia, pretty much. The abbreviation in the horticultural trade for Phalaenopsis is FAL. So if you hear that, you'll know that that's what we're talking about here. Around light, Phalaenopsis are some of the orchid species that require the least amount of light, which means that they are generally more successful in an average everyday home environment than many other types of orchids that will require supplemental lighting. So these are great for your home enthusiasts. An east window is ideal for Phalaenopsis. A southern or western window must be shaded to ensure that the plant doesn't get burned. In terms of light, if you have an artificial light setup, it's recommended that you provide that orchid with no more than 1,500 foot candles worth of light. More than that will stress out the plant and may inhibit blooming or cause other issues. In terms of watering, Phalaenopsis prefer to stay somewhat moist, but not sopping wet all the time. The general rule for this type of species, as well as some others, is that you are really supposed to be watering it the day before the plant dries out. And there's lots of ways that you can sort of judge that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Humidity is a really important factor for a lot of orchids in terms of blooming and overall health. Phalaenopsis are sort of in the middle range. They prefer humidity around 50 to 80% range. If you get much above 50%, that can be difficult conditions to replicate inside a normal everyday house. You may have to think about putting amendments into your home, including humidity trays or terrariums. But your average everyday Phalaenopsis will be okay in the humidity level in an average home. In terms of potting preferences, Phalaenopsis, again, do like it a little bit more moist. So a lot of folks use a lot of sphagnum moss in the potting, but bark is absolutely an acceptable way to pot up a Phalaenopsis orchid. We'll talk a little bit more about additional potting media recommendations, but mounting is also a possibility. And for folks who don't know, mounting is basically where you strap the orchid directly to, say, a large piece of bark or even a piece of plastic or something like that to replicate its epiphytic home. So it won't actually be in much of any potting medium except for maybe a little bit of moss that you would put in there. So a lot of folks grow Phalaenopsis this way. However, that means that you will probably need to water it, if not every day, at least every other day. Dendrobiums are another really popular orchid, very familiar for a lot of folks. Again, a lot of leis are made out of this, in addition to plumerias. Dendrobium are much larger orchids genera with 1,800 individual species, not including hybrids. Dendrobiums are sympodial orchids. They can be epiphytic, lithophytic, and terrestrial. Again, they are native to Southeast Asia and Australia, primarily in the horticultural trade. They're abbreviated as DEN. From a lighting perspective, they need a lot more light than a Phalaenopsis orchid. So if you're in a lightly shaded south window, that's going to work well for a dendrobium. Probably east or west facing windows could potentially work if they're particularly bright and have unobstructed sunlight. From a foot light candle recommendation perspective, you're going to need to give them between 3,000 to 5,000 foot candles of light. Of course, this also varies by species, so definitely check in on your individual species before you make these assumptions. Watering, it again varies by species, but Dendrobium do prefer to stay fairly moist, but not sopping wet. Humidity range is somewhat similar to Phalaenopsis. Temperature, they prefer mostly warm temperatures, and we're going to talk a lot more about temperature groupings of orchids on a subsequent slide. But when we say warm, we're talking about, upper 70s into the 80s even. From potting perspective, a wide variety of potting media are acceptable for Dendrobium, including bark, sphagnum, perlite. Some folks use leca, and Dendrobium can also be mounted. Paphiopedilums, very popular species, sort of known as the slipper orchids. We actually have native slipper orchids, although not Paphiopedilums, from a different genera in our region here in Virginia. There are about 80 Paphiopedilums, not including hybrids. They're mostly sympodial terrestrial orchids, although there are a handful of epiphytic species as well. They're, again, mostly from Southeast Asia. Their horticultural terminology is PAF. From a lighting perspective, they're more akin to a Phalaenopsis in terms of wanting a lower light amount. An east window or a highly shaded south or western window could work. From a foot candle perspective, again, we're talking 1,000 to 1,500. In terms of watering, you basically treat them like other terrestrial houseplants that you have in your house. Use the finger test to make sure that it's not sopping wet anymore before you water it. From a humidity perspective, they do prefer a slightly drier environment than some of these other species, with humidity down to 40%. On the temperature side, this is one of those genera that actually prefers it a little bit cooler than some other tropical orchids. So you might find some paths that actually prefer to be in temperatures in the 60s all the way up to in the 80s. So it's a pretty diverse group of species. And from a potting perspective, again, since this is mostly a terrestrial orchid, you're going to be using a bark forward mix that is well draining. Of course, if it's an epiphytic version, then you would adjust the potting media accordingly. Cattleyas, beautiful genera of species, one of my favorites. There's about 120 species of Cattleyas recognized, not including hybrids. These are sympodial epiphytes. And this is the first orchid genera that we're talking about that's actually native to the Americas. So we talked about Central America down through, I think, Argentina. The horticultural abbreviation is C or cat. From a lighting perspective, this is an intermediate to higher light required orchid. They like east or west unshaded windows. Southern window probably should be shaded, but you may be able to get away with it. They prefer about 3,000 foot candles for artificial light setups. Watering, they do like to dry out before you water them again, unlike some other species. But if you have a miniature Cattleya or a seedling, you will need to water them. Humidity is 40 to 70%. Temperature, intermediate to warm. So you're talking about 70s or 80s during daytime temperatures. And from a potting mix, they like a wide array of things, including bark. They also like to be situated in baskets. We'll talk about planting your orchid in baskets and doing mounting in a couple of slides here, but there are a lot of alternatives. Oncidium and Tolumnia, a personal favorite of mine. There's about 340 species in this genera or this alliance. I will say that for a lot of folks who are in the trade, this grouping in particular is problematic in terms of giving general advice for how their care should be acquitted. Folks have said this is a messy genera in terms of the diversity of the care instructions in terms of Oncidium. So this is a grouping that you really do need to know your species. These are sympodial orchids, mostly epiphytic. The Tolumnia is a specific subgrouping of this genera. They're miniature plants that don't necessarily produce pseudobulbs. So again, this is sort of how the messiness comes in here. That the picture on the bottom is a Tolumnia. They're adorable little miniature orchids that grow in fans, like little fan shapes. And they produce lovely blossoms for you that will last a really long time. They're, again, New World orchids, native from the Caribbean to Argentina. The horticultural abbreviation is ONC, O-N-C. These are highlight orchids. They like light up to 5,000 to 6,000 foot candles. So you're talking about a southern facing window or some artificial light in order to keep them thriving. Watering, since these do have pseudobulbs, they do have an internal storage capacity to store water. They need a little less frequent watering than some other types. You want it to partially dry out a little bit before you give it that next drink of water. But again, you need to know your species, because there are some exceptions to that rule. From a humidity perspective, these are some of the orchids that can deal with the drier environment. So they can deal with a humidity down to 30%. Temperature, we're talking intermediate to warm, again, 70s or 80s. And the potting mix, depending on the type of the specific species, can be coarser. So we're talking about bark mix, even charcoal. Folks use some charcoal. My little Tolumnias are potted up in charcoal in those terracotta pots. They're great species. I cannot recommend Oncidiums enough. Bulbophyllums, second to last genera we're going to talk about here. Really interesting grouping of plants, a very large grouping of plants, more than 2,000 individual species, not including hybrids, which means that they are the largest orchid genus. They are mostly sympodial epiphytes or lithophytes. They are pantropical, meaning that they are in the New World and the Old World. They show up in Asia, Africa, Australia, and Latin America. Their horticultural abbreviation is bulb. From a lighting perspective, it does vary depending on the species. Most of them like that intermediate level of light, east or west shade, unshaded windows, 2,500 to 3,500 foot candles. But again, you have to know your species. I have a bulbophyllum right here next to me that likes almost complete shade. So you just really need to know your species again. Watering, bulbophyllums do prefer a lot more moisture than some other types of orchids, so keep them well watered. Especially if they're mounted on a piece of bark or something like that, you're going to have to run it under the sink pretty much every day to keep it happy. From a temperature perspective, they like it warm, so upper 70s into the 80s. And from a potting perspective, depending on how you're potting it up, you're going to want to make sure that you're including some ingredients there that can be moisture retentive. So like moss, for instance, sphagnum moss is a must with many bulbos. Hanging baskets are also very popular for bulbophyllum as well as mounting. The last one that I'll talk about here is the Vanda and Neophoenicia. There's about 90 species in this grouping. They're mostly monopodial epiphytes, but there are a few terrestrial species as well. Neophoenicia used to be a separate genera. It was folded into Vanda. One thing that you'll notice if you get into orchids is that they're rearranging these things all the time, so you gotta have to keep up with it in some ways. But Neophoenicias are a really interesting little subgrouping there. They're called wind orchids or samurai orchids. They've been cultivated in Japan for centuries. Really cute, really pretty plants. Vandas are really instantly recognizable when they're hanging up. So you can see the example of the plant on the top. It's just hanging from a wire with a basket from a rafter. The Vanda that I have in my bathroom window is about 4 feet long. When you factor in the roots, they're really interesting species to look at, very unusual. They are from South Asia and Southeast Asia, India, Thailand, Indonesia. Their horticultural abbreviation is V. These are about the highest light orchids, along with the oncidiums that you will encounter. A southern window is really going to work well for them. In an artificial lighting setup situation, you're going to need 4,000 to 6,000 foot candles. I will say Vandas can be challenging to light artificially due to their size and sort of the way that they grow. Watering, again, if this is hung up or it's in a basket or it's mounted, you're going to need to water it pretty frequently. Basically, if it's potted though, and people do sometimes pot their orchids, you want to water it just as the medium is drying out. They do prefer a little bit more humidity than some other species, around 65%. So my Vanda does very well in my bathroom. In that southern facing window, they do like a warm temperature, so upper 70s into the 80s. And again, there are a lot of different ways that you can display your Vanda, potted or baskets, or even just hanging up. The one that I have in my bathroom is just hanging up on a coat hook, but it works very well for it. So I just want to again note that, this is just a little sampling of popular orchid genera that we've talked about. There are so many others. There's 800 genera in total. Some other really popular ones that I just didn't have time to squeeze into today's presentation include Miltonia, Epidendrum, Phragmipedium, Cymbidium, cool weather-loving orchid. That Dracula orchid with the little monkey-looking face in the corner is a popular species for many enthusiasts. And the one on the bottom right there is my Zygopetalum Australia Advance, which is my favorite orchid in my collection. It smells like honey and nectar, and it gave me blossoms that lasted for about 4 months last time it bloomed. So I could not recommend that one enough. It's also important to note, as I mentioned earlier, orchids are all around the globe, including right here in our region. So here are 5 examples of orchids that you could find out on a hike in the woods here in Virginia, including the Goodyear pubescens, the downy rattlesnake plantain, which by the looks of it, a lot of folks wouldn't necessarily identify as an orchid, but it does produce a pale flower spike. There are 2 different lady slippers that I've included here, the yellow lady slipper and the pink lady slipper. Absolutely gorgeous flowers. What a treat to run into them on your hike. That yellow fringed orchid, really out of this world looking blossom, really cool looking plants. And that showy orchid, Galliera spectabilis, is a popular plant in the horticultural trade. You can buy a lot of these species from native plant vendors, but it's also important to note that 50% of our native orchid species in the United States are considered threatened or endangered, and poaching in the wild is an issue. We don't want you to dig up these orchids if you find them out on your hike. And if you are going to be buying some of these plants from a vendor, try and do a little bit of research to make sure that they're not poaching it from the wild as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause here and see if folks have any questions before we move on.
Yes, they do. Ben, if you're repotting a Phalaenopsis, should the air roots be put into the potting medium?
No, the air roots should be exposed to the air. Some roots will be in the soil, but it's absolutely acceptable to have the air roots exposed to the air. In fact, they would prefer that. I'll show you this one here. This is that Pikachu orchid that I had in my place. You may be able to see this. The orchid aerial roots are absolutely exposed.
That looks like a happy orchid.
It's about to bloom too.
Another question, if you bring home a grocery store Phalaenopsis, would it be happier if you transplanted it onto a structure instead of leaving it in the tiny pot it came in?
So a lot of Phalaenopsis orchids like their roots to be crowded in the pot. So if you see them and it looks a little tight, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You do want to make sure that there's air accessible to the roots because they will require some oxygen. You don't want to get root rot. I generally do try to repot my orchids when I purchase them, and it's less from the perspective of crowding, but more from the perspective of inspecting the roots, making sure that the growing media that it's in has not already broken down or rotted. So that is a step that I take. It's not required. But one thing that you should do when you bring a new orchid into your collection is quarantine it from the rest of your collection. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but a lot of orchids can bring pests, diseases, and other troublesome things into your collection. So kind of keep them in a separate space for a couple weeks until you know for sure that it's okay.
Okay. I think you're going to be talking about this later, but maybe you want to answer it now. How would you transplant an orchid onto a structure? Do you want to save that?
Onto a mount or something like that. Yeah, that's probably a little more of a 201 level discussion, but basically all you would need to do would be to gently take that Phalaenopsis orchid out of its current potting situation, out of the growing medium, inspect it. You want to clip off any dead roots that you see in there, any root rot situation you want to handle. But basically, if you're going to be mounting this orchid, you're going to want to select a really cool looking branch or something like that. And a lot of folks just use like wire or jute twine to mount them directly onto that piece of wood or even plastic. It's important when you have a mounted orchid, though, that there's not a lot of growing media there. A lot of folks do sort of tuck in some sphagnum moss around some of the roots while they are mounting it in order to have a little bit of moisture retention. Soaking a mounted plant is a good suggestion in terms of watering it, but you just really need to make sure that it is getting enough water to meet its needs. There's lots of really great guidance online in terms of repotting orchids and mounting. So there's more specific advice that can be offered.
Okay. Someone asked about first steps when you bring an orchid home, which I think you've addressed, but they also asked, is tap water a no-no?
Tap water is perfectly acceptable for many orchid species. Again, you'll need to know your specific species to know if you're dealing with one that which has specific sensitivities. Some orchids are sensitive to particles in the water. If you over fertilize, for instance, that's an issue for many orchids. But generally speaking, like for your average everyday grocery store orchid, tap water is absolutely fine. You don't want to use distilled water because I believe that actually takes out some of the nutrients that it would need to draw from. The general recommendation is to use just regular tap water.
Can you salvage an orchid that gets root rot?
Yes, you can try, and you can probably succeed. With root rot, what you're going to be doing is clipping off the nasty parts of the roots, and anything that's mushy or black looking, slimy, you want to get rid of that. The important thing in this situation is to let it dry out for a little bit, change the media. If you have an orchid with too much root rot, too much moisture, maybe lighten up on the sphagnum moss in the mix a little bit or alter your watering preferences.
Can you transplant a fowl while it's blooming?
You can transplant a flower when it's blooming. It could potentially stress out the plant and cause the blossoms to drop. It's called bud blast, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide.
Do Virginia native orchids make good houseplants?
I would recommend keeping them outdoors. They're used to that outdoor environment here in our region, so that's their preferred environment. I have never experimented with trying to grow a Virginia native orchid.
Someone asked about watering with ice cubes. I think you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, don't do it. We'll talk about that more later.
Let's see, someone says the bloom on my Ludicea is fading and some of the foliage is yellowing now. Any ideas what's causing that?
I will just say a lot of folks get a little bit freaked out when their blossom on their orchid drops. This is a natural thing. The orchid blossoms do last a really long time, but they're not permanent. So this might just be the natural life cycle of your orchid and it's just dropping its bloom because it's done blooming. The foliage, I guess it depends on whether or not you're talking about just the bottom leaves of your plant or anything like that. There are a lot of different reasons why an orchid could turn yellow. It could be a nutrient deficiency issue. It could be a sunburn issue. So Stephanie, I would recommend sending a picture of your plant to our help desk so that we could specifically diagnose your issues.
Are you going to be able to give us any tips for?
So moving along to some of the care tips here, I think a lot of folks are eager to talk about how to keep your Phalaenopsis orchid thriving in your home. It starts with selecting a good plant, right? So there was a question about this already. Things to look for when you are selecting a new plant. Number one, is it in spike? And spike means it has generated a flower, a stem that's coming up, but has not generated significant buds or flowers yet at this point. If you do buy an orchid with a flower spike on it, I'd recommend buying one in the bud stage. The flowers haven't opened yet. If you buy an orchid at the grocery store, for instance, and the flowers are already open, you have no way of knowing how long those flower buds had been open for. They could have been open for 3 months and you take it home and they drop off in a couple of days. And that's not what you really want. So I recommend going for an orchid with maybe only one bud open or all of them closed so that you really extend the lifespan of that initial bloom cycle that you have. If it's possible, if you can see them, especially if the plant is in like a clear container, the roots that you can see in there should be firm, green, not mushy or brown. You want to make sure that you're not bringing any rot conditions home with you. The leaves shouldn't have any spots or fungal issues present. They should be firm, not floppy or wrinkly, because that could indicate dehydration. It's important to note, and this is something that a lot of folks don't understand about Phalaenopsis in particular, is the color of the Phalaenopsis leaf, if it is healthy, is going to be about the same as the color of healthy grass. So when you see a Phalaenopsis orchid and that leaf is really dark green, generally that means it's not getting enough light. That's not necessarily a sign of a healthy plant. It's also important to note that a lot of the Phalaenopsis that you'll run into, like in the grocery store, may have been injected with some otherworldly colored dye, a pink dye or blue dye, or I think the most common ones that I've seen around there. It looks very artificial. It's very easy to clock a dyed plant. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with this plant. It's usually a white Phalaenopsis orchid. And so next bloom cycle, you'll probably just get white orchid blossoms. That dye is not going to stick around permanently. I think it looks prettier white, but just be buyer beware when you're thinking about these dyed plants. It's not going to look like that forever. It's also really important to note that some orchid species, if you're looking for really specific ones, they can be very expensive. I'm constantly keeping myself from buying $50 cattleyas online that are close to blooming stage. But it's important to note that if you do want some more expensive orchid species in your collection or trying to just sort of be conscious of price, you can buy seedling orchids, which are a couple of years away from blooming size. They will be much less expensive than ones that are a little bit closer. Just be aware that you're going to have to nurture that plant for a couple of years to get it to bloom, but that could be a fun adventure in and of itself. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when you do bring a new plant into your collection, you do want to quarantine it. My recommendation is for up to 2 weeks, just so that you can monitor it for any signs of pests or stress. It's important when you do a work around orchids or really anything in the gardening space that you're taking care of yourself in terms of your own safety, as well as practicing what we call good sanitation practices to make sure that your orchids stay healthy. So if you are gardening outside, our general recommendation always is to wear your sunglasses, your hats, sunscreen, and gloves to protect yourself if you work with outdoor orchids. Indoors, obviously you want to protect yourself as well to the extent possible, but the good sanitation practices are also really, really important, especially for orchids, because the communicable diseases that happen with orchids can be spread by dirty tools, for instance. So sanitizing any scissors or knives or anything that you're going to be using to prune your plants would be important to do. Making sure that you're removing dead material from the plants, isolating plants that are demonstrating signs of pests or diseases from the rest of your collection. These are all really important if you're going to be managing a collection of orchids in your home. And again, I'm going to say this about 20 times for this presentation: quarantine your new plants before they come in. I was just at the National Capital Orchid Society show and sale about a month ago, and a very reputable seller. I bought several great looking plants. I brought them home. I had them in quarantine, and lo and behold, one of them had brown rot all over it about 2 days later. So you never know what you're bringing home. A really important note around orchids is that propagation is very different for orchids than it is for many other house plants, where you would just maybe take a cutting and try and root that cutting, and then lo and behold, you have a new plant. Orchids, the way that they propagate themselves was a mystery to humans for a long, long time. Scientists did not really discover how orchids self-propagated until the end of the 19th century. And humans didn't propagate orchids by seed until 1922. So just underscoring here that this is a very difficult thing to consider because of the way that orchids do propagate, right? So orchid seeds themselves are extremely tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye. They don't have an endosperm to store nutrients to support its development. So that means that orchid seeds by themselves cannot germinate in the ground or on a tree branch or anything like that, wherever it's going to be growing. Orchids really depend on a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi that is present in the soil or other places to provide seeds with food and to promote the germination. Basically, what happens in nature is that an orchid seed will be invaded by these mycorrhizal fungi, and in select situations, the seed can essentially overpower the fungi and use the fungus as a food source since it doesn't have that endosperm. That's how seed germination occurs with orchids. Again, this is possible. People have done it. It is possible to do in a completely sterile environment using flasks and an orchid-specific agar solution. This is not a 101 level thing to do, so it is not recommended to try propagating via seed. Also, it's important to note that if you're looking to propagate an orchid, especially a hybrid, if you try to propagate it by seed, it may not have the same characteristics as the mother plant did, because you're going to be mixing up the genetics between two different plants because of the pollination aspect here. So if you are looking to propagate a plant, cloning is actually the best thing to consider for many applications. So a lot of those hybrid plants that you see in the store are actually clones Mericloning is a process that growers use. They basically harvest some material from the growth tip of the plant and they separate it into multiple different samples and grow clones from those tissues. There's nothing wrong with mericloning. If you're looking for an orchid with very specific characteristics or a hybrid, you're probably going to be getting a mericlone, especially if you are looking for specific characteristics that are valued by some folks in the orchid trade, including peloric blooms. So this blossom that we have in front of us here is a peloric bloom, which means that this has a mutation present which causes the flower blossom to be more radially symmetrical rather than bilaterally symmetrical. If you remember the slide on the blossom orchid anatomy, this is just an example of how that would look. It looks a little bit different. People really appreciate this, but if you grow your new orchid by a seed, the baby plant probably won't have this characteristic. How do folks accomplish propagation at home if you don't have the mericloning technology? It's actually, I won't say completely easy, but there is a way to do it at home through what's called keiki propagation. Keiki is a word that describes basically an orchid baby. Many orchid genera do generate keiki on their stems or at the base of the plant. So this Phalaenopsis that you see has several keiki that is developing on its flower spike. These keiki, when they begin to grow on your flower spike, you can separate them from the flower spike after they have generated at least 2 or 3 roots to survive on their own. Once you've done that, you can use a clean sterilized knife to separate it from that plant, pot it up, and boom, you have a clone of your old orchid. It's also important to note that you can actually force your Phalaenopsis orchid to produce a keiki for you. There is a solution that you can buy online called keiki paste that you would rub on a dormant flower bud, and it will cause a keiki to be generated at that flower node. Right? There are specific nutrients that are included in that keiki paste that prompt that orchid to make that baby. Epidendrum and oncidium orchids also produce keiki, but in a different way. They produce offsets that can be divided and repotted. In fact, a lot of orchids, including cattleyas and bulbophyllums, can be propagated by division. You will need to understand the specific characteristics of your orchid species before attempting to do that. So I would suggest doing some research before you do that, just to make sure you're not going to inadvertently kill your orchid. In terms of indoor care, we're going to talk about a few things here quickly: light, temperature, watering, fertilization, humidity, airflow, potting media, potting and repotting, and potting for our seasons. So we already talked a little bit about some specific recommendations for grow lights for a light setup, but just to explain these terms a little bit, if you hear a grower telling you that this orchid needs direct light, that basically is akin to broad daylight. It's unobstructed light from a window. Bright indirect light, on the other hand, is light that does not directly hit the plant from the light source. So maybe it's a slightly shaded window, or you're keeping the plant in a situation in your home which is adjacent to window, but maybe not directly in front of it. Again, many orchids are very light-loving species, and they will prefer that direct light or lightly shaded direct light. But for your Phalaenopsis, Paphs, and some other species, you're going to want to not give them that direct light because that could actually harm them. Grow lights can be very complicated for people to understand. Some really important tips to start off with is that you should be avoiding incandescent lights at all costs. They generate more heat than light, and that's not necessarily good for your orchids. LEDs and fluorescent tubes are really the recommended way to go in terms of grow lights. Again, you have to know the genera and your specific species light requirements, as there's quite a range in terms of the light requirements for different types of orchids. You can use smartphone apps to measure the light output of your grow lights to make sure that they're getting enough light for their needs. You can actually measure that light right above the plant leaf, because the amount of light that hits your plant at the leaf is going to be different than the amount of light that is generated at the bulb, right? And so it's suggested that you place your orchid no more than 24 inches away from an LED lamp, for instance, in order for it to receive the amount of light that is indicated on the packaging. It's recommended you set up a timer on these lights. If you do have grow lights inside, 14 hours is the maximum recommended amount of light to give to an orchid. They do need a nighttime rest. Generally speaking, full spectrum lights are best for most orchids, but some people do swear by red and blue lights, especially to get them to bloom. Light angle should be directly overhead. And remember, even LED lights do produce a little bit of heat. Here in my office, I have a lot of LED lights, and the temperature routinely gets to 82 or 83 degrees. So airflow is important to moderate the temperature, but also just be aware that under grow lights, your orchids will dry out more quickly than in a lot of other situations in your home. So you may need to water them more frequently. Temperature is also really important for many orchids. Most of the orchids you will grow in your home are not cold hardy, meaning they will not survive a freeze, so don't put them outside in the winter, obviously. I mentioned earlier that many orchids are grouped by temperature ranges. There are warm, intermediate, and cool growing orchids. The temperature ranges here are defined on the slide. It's also really important to know, and this is something that a lot of folks don't know, orchids really do require a significant temperature differential between day and night in order to thrive. So it's recommended that orchids have up to a 15-degree swing in the temperature between day and night to keep them happy and healthy. Again, you will need to know your specific species to know about their preferences, but you should consider, if you're going to have an orchid collection in your home, investing in a temperature and humidity monitor so you can keep on top of this. Watering trips up a lot of people. It's actually a little less complicated than folks assume. It will vary by species. So again, know your species, but most orchids, you can generally follow the rule of water it the day before the plant dries out. You should be okay. Does my plant need more water right now? You can sort of pick up the pot, and if it feels really light, that might be a good way to judge if it needs a little bit more water. You can stick your finger in there in the sphagnum moss and see if it has completely dried out or not. Again, don't use ice cubes. I know there's a big commercial operation out there that is specifically geared up towards recommending people to put ice cubes on their plants. It's a marketing gimmick. An ice cube only has a couple of tablespoons of water in it in the first place, which is not enough for that plant to survive. Also, just using common sense, these orchids are from the tropics. They've never seen ice a day in their lives. It's just not good for them. It could damage the roots. So please don't do this. Your plant will be dehydrated and it will not like you. You should avoid overwatering more than underwatering. There are a lot of rot issues and moisture issues that can come up with overwatering, although underwatering can be an issue as well. If you see your leaves and pseudobulbs start to wrinkle up and look raisinish, that's why you know that you may need to do more frequent watering. It's important to note around dehydration, that's not an issue with the amount of water you're providing in an individual watering session. It's the frequency with which you are watering is probably the issue. Top watering, as this person is doing from the sink, is perfectly acceptable for a Phalaenopsis orchid, although mounted or hanging orchids will probably do better with a soak, and they will need more frequent watering than a plant that is put in with sphagnum moss like this. It's also really recommended to water in the morning if possible to avoid rotting situations where overnight in the cooler overnight hours there's water sitting on the crown of the plant that could cause crown rot issues. It's also important to note that some species, including a lot of dendrobium, do require a winter dry period with cooler temps and reduced watering. They're actually deciduous plants, so they drop a lot of their leaves over the winter, and you need to treat them actually a little bit similarly to how you treat some cacti and succulents in terms of just holding up on some of that watering and fertilization. Over the winter, a lot of orchids do require some fertilization. Fertilizing, you want to use a low urea balanced formula. There's lots of orchid specific formulations out there. The general recommendation is to water weekly. So maybe do a quarter strength recommended dosage for that plant every time you water, except for once a month when you flush it with just plain water in order to get rid of the salts or fertilizers that might be accumulating in that potting media. It is possible to over fertilize a plant. If you see brown leaf tips, dead or brown root tips, or a salty crust on the top, that could be an indication. And again, some orchids will not like to be fertilized over the winter. Humidity and airflow is a really important consideration. Again, a lot of these plants are epiphytic in nature, so they need air in order to survive. So your potting situation and your whole setup should be geared towards your plant-specific humidity and airflow needs. They do like a gentle air movement, not directly onto the plant, but just sort of in the environment. So consider like a ceiling fan or a desk fan or something, oscillating fan to help to promote some air movement, reduce fungal issues, particularly in the potting situation. If you're using a plastic pot, you can use those famous orchid pots with the little slots in them to allow roots to access oxygen. Also, it's on a humidity level. This is a picture in front of us from my setup. These are some orchids that I put in a tray that I got at like Williams Sonoma, I think, with a bunch of beads. Those help to retain the water that goes through the plants when I water it, and it stays nice and moist in there for these species that do require a lot of moisture and humidity. Again, investing in a temperature and humidity monitor would be recommended. From a potting perspective, the media of the pot should be really derived from the needs of your specific plant. So again, know your species. Terrestrials and moisture-loving plants will like a little bit mossier or a lot more sphagnum moss in that mix. It should be porous and allow for moisture and water to run through it, but there should be some element of the potting media that will allow for moisture retention. Some podials and plants with pseudobulbs will prefer a chunkier mix. It's okay to put a little bit of moss in there, but a moss forward mix is probably not recommended. And again, many vandas, cattleyas, and dendrobiums may actually prefer to be in a hanging basket situation with little to no media whatsoever. So commonly used potting media include sphagnum moss, bark, perlite, charcoal, leca, coir, peat, and lava rock. Just a note on the sphagnum moss, though, if it's possible, try and buy high quality sphagnum moss. It's called long fibered moss. Orchid hobbyists swear by AAA moss from New Zealand. It's more moisture retentive. You also want to steer clear of moss that you may get at a big box store that has dye in it. Artificial dye is not necessarily a good thing for your plants. In terms of potting, the situation itself, um, repotting your orchid is recommended every 1 to 2 years so that you can inspect those roots for any rot issues, as well as change out the potting media. As bark breaks down over time, it essentially turns into soil and becomes too dense and will not allow oxygen to reach your roots of your orchid. So again, repotting is recommended on a periodic cycle. Repotting after a bloom cycle is completed is recommended. It's a great strategy. The orchid's already going to be sort of going into a dormancy period as it's sort of aggregating more energy for its next bloom cycle, concentrating on sort of roots and getting itself back to full energy. So it is a good time to consider repotting. As I've been mentioning, there are many different form factors for pots. That Vanda, that pretty blue Vanda on the top there is in an orchid basket. It just looks like a shopping basket you would get at the grocery store. And there may be some bark in there. There may be a little bit of sphagnum moss, but it's really an air plant, the way that it's potted in that environment. All right. That crazy looking bulbophyllum on the top left, that's an example of a mounted orchid. This is a huge orchid that's been put up on a large sheet of, looks like bark. A lot of sphagnum moss has been strapped to that. They're going to need to be watering that very frequently. On the bottom there are a couple of pots that you will potentially see. That slotted plastic pot that I've mentioned is a great option for many orchids. You can put that in a decorative cache pot and water it directly into the pot there. Those upside down hanging planters, actually, that's in my mother's greenhouse or sunroom in Colorado. It's a really interesting way of growing orchids, which actually helps the orchids to grow in a more natural way. You can see that the flower spike is actually growing downward. It's pendant. That's how it would grow in nature versus staking it up and upright. So my mother has to actually water those through a little hole on the top right onto the orchid roots. It's a really cute setup. So summering in the yard is another thing that some people do with many of their orchids. A lot of orchids do like to be outside during the summer here in Greater Washington and in Northern Virginia because it does get to be kind of subtropical around here. You do want to make sure that if you are going to be bringing your orchid out for the summer, that you're seeking to replicate the light and moisture and airflow conditions that they've enjoyed indoors as much as possible, at least in a transition phase. Maybe bring your orchid out for an hour on the first day, 2 hours the second day, just sort of slowly acclimate it to the outdoors instead of just chucking it out there one day in the spring. You could give your plant a little bit of shock if you do that. You're also going to want to potentially transition your plant back indoors at the end of the season as well. Also, just know that outdoors, your orchid's going to be exposed to different pests and issues that you would be indoors. I don't usually have squirrels nibbling on my orchids here in my office, but outside it is an issue. So monitoring your orchids while they're outside is really important. I almost lost my oldest, most prized orchid because I left it out inside in the summer and inadvertently left it directly in the line of our sprinklers. And so it was getting a full shot of water, way too much water every single day. It was keeping way too moist. It got rotted and I almost lost it. Also, this should go without saying, but it happens to a lot of people. Bring your orchid back in before it gets too cold, right? Cold damage on orchid is not a good thing. Colleen, any questions that we can answer right now?
Do orchids care whether you sanitize your tools with alcohol or bleach, or is either acceptable?
I generally use alcohol as long as you are washing it off. I think you should be good to go.
Someone asked, I believe I lost my flowers due to the first watering. I have lost 2 plants this way. What should I do to save the plant before the leaves begin to shrivel up?
Yeah, so I'm intuiting that maybe this person is saying that they lost the blossoms after they brought them into the house and for the first watering. This is unfortunately a common experience with many home growers with orchids. Orchids do experience stress when they move from one environment to the other. So if you're bringing a new orchid into your home and if that environment is pretty different from where it was previously, it may just get testy with you and drop its blossoms so that it can sort of get used to its new environment. This is called bud blast. It does happen from time to time, unfortunately. The best thing to do is just sort of take stock of the plant's overall health, make sure that it is in the right sort of environment. We're going to talk in a little bit more on a subsequent slide about how to get your orchid to rebloom. So there'll be some good tips there.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Someone else asked, is your bloom size relative to the maturity of the plant, or is it a characteristic of the plant and won't change as the plant grows?
It's generally a characteristic of the plant. You have like mini Phalaenopsis orchids, for instance, with little tiny blossoms, and then my big moth orchid right here next to my head has blossoms this big. I will say that if you have an orchid that's really unhealthy, if it doesn't do a flower spike for you, sometimes those blossoms might be a little bit mutated or smaller or something like that. So it could be an indication of overall health, but generally speaking, a miniature phal is going to stay miniature.
Okie doke. If the Phalaenopsis orchid has lost all its roots to rot, can you still save it if it retains its leaves?
Potentially, again, this is more of a 201 level conversation, but you want to take remove any potting media, make sure that you are removing any of the dead or rotting materials. In some cases, you can get an orchid to generate new roots, aerial roots, especially from the plant stem, if the rot issue has not infected the stem. It's worth a shot.
Someone has a Cattleya orchid that they bought online about 5 years ago, and it has never bloomed.
It's probably the environment that it's in. If it's still with you after 5 years, it probably doesn't have like a terminal disease or anything that's causing that. So it could be something having to do with the light, the humidity, maybe the temperature differential that you have in your home is not sufficient to encourage the bloom. So it could be a lot of things. So I know we're getting a little bit short on time, so I'm going to jet through some of these slides on pests. Since it doesn't seem like there's many folks on the line here that are encountering these, but a lot of normal everyday houseplant pests do attack orchids as well. Aphids can be a challenge, very common orchid pests. Luckily, they are fairly easy to control. You can mechanically pick them off your plant or use a jet of water. If you have a persistent issue with aphids on your plants, you can also use insecticidal soap, which is a good option for this bug and many others. Black rot has come up a couple times in our conversation today. It's evidenced by spreading black patches on leaves, pseudobulbs, or roots. This is not a good thing. It's generally caused by fungi that thrive in moist environments. If your orchid is too moist, rot can be an issue. If the rot reaches the crown of the plant, especially on a Phalaenopsis where there's that one growth point where all the leaves come out, that is fatal to the plant. So you do want to sector off any black rot that you see on the plant and also isolate the plant as well. It goes without saying that any of these plants, any plant that you have that's experiencing most of these conditions, you want to isolate it. You could try to use commercially available fungicides. Cinnamon is something that folks use to protect the remaining plant after you do cut out any rot. It's also important to note that the rot can be on the roots, so repotting might be a good idea. You definitely want to inspect the roots and make sure that you are ensuring enough air circulation for that plant. Rot is potentially treatable, but if it goes too far, then you will lose the plant. Sunburn and heat stress can be issues for plants both indoors and outdoors. A lot of folks who put their Phalaenopsis orchids outside in a place that's a little bit too sunny might experience a leaf that looks like this. You get some browning or yellowing. Sunburn starts to present as reddish purple margins around your leaves. Heat stress looks a little bit more like shriveled or leathery looking leaves and pseudobulbs. So again, in this situation, you need to know the specific needs that your plant has for sunlight and heat and make sure that you're checking in on the humidity and air movement. Mites are an issue with all houseplants, including orchids. Red spider mites are very small and hard to see. They're really indicated by the webbing that they leave behind, as opposed to flat mites, which are also very small, but they don't leave the webbing behind. These are sucking insects that will feed off of the sap of your plant. They are really prevalent in areas of warm and dry conditions with poor ventilation. Luckily, mites are fairly easily controlled mechanically with a stream of water, but again, insecticidal soap is also effective. Mealybugs on the scale, similarly common houseplant pests. The pictures are here. The mealybugs are the little white fluffy looking things, and the scale are those callousy looking insects. They're actually related to each other. They are soft-bodied insects, and so if you have an issue with these bugs, you can use a diluted alcohol solution to kill them. You can use insecticidal soap, but you just want to make sure that you're using it judiciously. If you have a seedling plant, a tender plant, you may want to use a cotton swab to apply it rather than spraying it directly on. Neem oil is also a possibility here. But if you get serious infestations, this is also important to note that these bugs can be in the potting media, so you may need to repot it if you have a recurring issue. Same thing with thrips. Thrips are my nemesis. I can't stand thrips. Thrips are so annoying because they're so small. You will not notice them on your houseplant until the plant is sick and damaged, right? So you see the symptoms of the thrips infection oftentimes before you see the thrips themselves. Thrips are also very mobile creatures. They can go from one of your plants to many others very quickly. So isolating a plant that's showing damage from thrips is important. They attack the buds and the flowers primarily, but they can also attack the rest of the plant. They can be really difficult to get rid of, I'll be honest with you. Insecticidal soap can work, but thrips can come back. So isolate, isolate, isolate. I've had to throw away a plant or two because of the thrips issue. Sometimes it's just easier. Fungus gnats, also very annoying. Little tiny black flies that look kind of like mosquitoes. They thrive in environments that are consistently moist. So if you have a real bad fungus gnat issue, you should check in on your watering schedule. Yellow sticky traps are really good at capturing the adult stage of the fungus gnat. If you are encountering a really serious issue, though, you should consider buying some mosquito bits with that bacillus bacteria in it, also known as mosquito dunks. It works really well. You just put the mosquito bits in the water when you water it, and it will kill off the larval stage of the fungus gnats. It's also important to note that there is a perception that fungus gnats are more of an annoyance than something that will hurt the plant, but they do form maggots, and the maggots that are in your plant will eat the roots. So they do actually damage your plant. There are fungal issues, including botrytis fungi that shows up as dark spots on your flowers. Again, this is an issue with air circulation and temperature. Leaf spot is a fungus as well that spreads in warmer temperatures and looks like small dark spots on the leaves. Again, you're going to be isolating these plants, removing the infected parts of the plants, and potentially using fungicides on the healthier parts of the plant to save them. You also will probably need to alter your watering practices to allow the plant to dry out before nightfall if you're consistently getting fungal issues. Viruses, the last one that I'll talk about here, there are more than 30 known viruses that can infect orchid. Many different symptoms here that can show up around viruses, including chlorotic or necrotic lesions on leaves, yellowing leaves, yellow stripes, circular ring spots, or a general decline in health of your plant for no apparent reason might be an indication that your plant does have a virus. These are really hard to diagnose, honestly, unless you have some really specific symptoms showing up like the ring spot there. There are lab tests that are available to identify the specific orchid virus, but in most cases, these viruses are fatal, unfortunately. Infected plants should be probably discarded since they may also spread to the rest of your collection. So I'll just cover a couple of real quick frequently asked questions that I see here with orchids, and then we can open up to your questions. So the first one here, my flowers fell off and the spike turned brown. Is my plant dead? Again, orchids, like most plants, do go through a bloom cycle, so it's not necessarily a sign that your plant is dead. Your Phalaenopsis orchid should rebloom once every 8 to 12 months, although reblooming is possible. So the secondary question is here, when do I cut off my flower spike? Basically, if it's green, you should leave it on because there's a possibility that it'll grow another little side branch and give you some more blossoms. Although if it turns brown, like one of the spikes that you see on this plant, it is okay for you to clip that off for aesthetic purposes as well. Why won't my orchid rebloom? So again, orchids can be finicky about blooming given their environmental conditions. So if you have an orchid that's being stubborn, is not reblooming for you, you can try a couple of different things here. Check in on the temperature. Make sure that that plant is getting that temperature differential between day and night. If it doesn't, maybe move it to a different part of your home that does have a wider swing. If you're keeping your plant next to a radiator, for instance, that's going to keep that plant probably consistently warm. Try sticking it in a window with the appropriate light conditions. In a window, that glass is going to allow for more temperature differential, so that could be a good thing to try. You could try incrementally also increasing the amount of light that you're giving the plant. It could be a light issue. Increasing the humidity level or fertilization could be other things that you could try to prompt that orchid to rebloom for you. The picture on the slide here is a path that I have that I ordered online, and similar to, I think, one of the questions previously, I ordered it online and it was already in blossom. And as soon as I got it into my collection, the blossom died. This is called bud blast. Bud blast is oftentimes a signal of stress that the plant is undergoing. Creating an orchid blossom and flower spike are probably some of the most energy intensive things that an orchid can do. So if an orchid experiences stress, it may just say, I can't deal with this blossom right now. It's got to go. I got to figure out what's going on in my new environment for a little bit here. So again, some similar recommendations to getting your orchid to rebloom. You just want to make sure that your environment that you have your orchid in is correct for that particular orchid species. But just know if you get an orchid that's shipped to you in spike or in bud, there is a likelihood that those blossoms could fall off for you. Last FAQ slide here. My plant is flowering at the crown. Is this a death bloom? So you see this picture and see how the flower spike on this Phalaenopsis is coming directly from the center of the plant instead of off of the side of the plant or between the leaves. This is called a terminal spike. Basically, what's happening here is that the orchid has generated a flower spike in the place where it would normally generate new leaves. If this happens, this orchid will not be able to generate new leaves. And so as the orchid ages and the older leaves on the bottom just slowly die off, this plant will likely die, unfortunately. But the good news is that plants that do get a terminal spike, it's pretty frequent that they will create a keiki for you. If you don't get a keiki automatically or naturally generated on your plant, you could also try the keiki paste cloning method if you have a terminal spike orchid that you particularly enjoy and want to see survive. But unfortunately, terminal spikes are generally, as the name would suggest, terminal. Last question here. My Phalaenopsis orchid is losing its lower leaves. Is it sick? So there are many issues with orchids that could cause leaf drop. If you're seeing all of the leaves on the orchids at the same time, or you're turning wrinkly or yellow, that could be an issue with the plant systemically that you want to look into. But if you're talking about, especially like a Phalaenopsis orchid, and you're just talking about the bottom leaves there, that's a natural process. Those bottom leaves will naturally die off over time as it generates the new ones on the top. Generally recommended that you leave those fading leaves on the plant until they're completely dried out, because your plant is reabsorbing some of the nutrients that were held in that leaf in order to encourage its ongoing growth. It's also important to note that some podial orchids do lose leaves on their older pseudobulbs as well. And this is normal. And some species like Dendrobium, for instance, are deciduous and they'll drop their leaves seasonally. So again, I think the biggest lesson on today's presentation is know your species and know the care tips that are going to be required to keep it thriving. So Colleen, I'll turn it back to you for more questions.
Okay, we have a few more. Someone asked about a Dendrobium orchid they purchased 3 or 4 years ago. Initially, the canes were all straight up, but now they have kind of flopped out over the edges of the container. And number one, is this a concern? And number two, if it is there a way to get it to grow straight up again?
I have a little dendrobium right here in my window, and the exact same thing happens. Dendrobiums, the canes can grow right, and they may flop. You can use like a garden support or stakes to keep it growing up normally. Is generally speaking, dendrobiums are just kind of like that. Again, in nature, they're not normally oriented to growing upright. If you remember one of those dendrobium slides that I showed earlier, the flowers were actually going straight down. So it's not necessarily a cause for concern. If you see that your dendrobium is experiencing or exhibiting other symptoms of unhealthiness, then maybe it would be something to explore. But if it was me, I would just try to use some stakes if I was trying to keep it upright.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked, would an air purifier provide sufficient airflow as opposed to a fan?
I don't know. That's a good question. I do have an air purifier here in my office. I don't think it really generates much airflow for me. I think that the general recommendation is you don't need to have a strong gust of wind in your grow setup, just a nice gentle breeze to make sure that the air movement is around. So if you can feel like air movement coming off of your hand, that might be enough. I would just I don't know. It depends on your machine.
Someone else asked, should you reduce the light once an orchid starts blooming?
I have not heard that as a cure tip for orchids in the past. So I don't believe so.
Okay. Someone else has a 20-year-old Phalaenopsis and its leaves are withering and looking leathery. It's a plant that has actually survived 3 different moves, and they wonder, any recommendations?
I have an orchid that sounds like we have the same orchid. My original orchids I actually bought in the late 90s, and it's still with me. Orchids do have a lifespan. They don't live forever. Generally speaking, the guidance is an orchid's going to live maybe, 10, 15 years or something. If it's well cared for, it can live longer than that. So you have an exceptionally long-lived orchid. Hope it's given you many of keiki in the past. It could be that it's just ailing because it's old. From the description with the wrinkly leaves, it sounds like it could potentially be dehydrated. So you can try increasing the frequency of the watering schedule to try and bring it back. And the next time it blooms, your really old orchid, you may want to try that keiki propagation paste to get a new plant. If you clone your old orchid in that way, the new keiki that's generated will be much more vitalous. And it's basically like the same plant. I am very sentimentally attached to my old orchid, though. I'm going to do everything but keep it healthy. Yeah, it's been a long time friend of mine.
Yeah. Okay. The bottom leaves on a recently acquired fowl turned yellow and soft almost immediately. The rest of the plant looks very healthy. Was that just stress?
It could have been just stress. It could be just natural that your Phalaenopsis is going into its next growth spurt. Maybe it could be that your environment is even better for that orchid than the one that it came from. So it's deciding to grow new leaves and therefore is sacrificing some of the old leaves to gather up some of that energy to do that. But yeah, orchids do. I have had this experience many times that you bring that new orchid into your environment, it gets a little stressed out. So you might see some worrying signs at first, but once that orchid stabilizes and ensuring that you have the correct environment for that orchid, hopefully it will right size itself.
Okay, Ben, that does it for the questions, and we want to thank you for really a wonderful, excellent presentation. I think we all learned an awful lot today, and we thank you for that.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out today. Really appreciate it.